Spy Cops Info Podcast, a series on the secret undercover political police that infiltrated over 1,000 groups since 1968. Episode 35, Class of 68 Part 1, Captain Birdseye navigating by calculator. Welcome to the Spy Cops Info Podcast. My name's Tom Fowler and I'm joined with...
Chris Bryan from the Undercover Research Group.
Okay, so today we're going to talk about the boss man, the original commanding officer of the Special Demonstration Squad, Conrad Dixon.
Going back now, and retro it feels a bit now, going right back to 1968.
This series has never been in any sort of chronological order. If we had done, I guess this is probably where we should have started or something.
Oh yeah, I guess there have been quite a few episodes since I've been doing a podcast with you, since then Tranche 2 has started. So it's good to remind ourselves to go back to how it all began.
Conrad Dixon claimed he invented the SDS, but as we always remind our listeners, we're dealing with a bunch of professional liars. How much truth is in that?
Well, it's kind of a weird debate, isn't it? Because one thing we should note is that before the undercover policing inquiry started, we did know a little bit about Conrad Dixon, mainly because of an obituary.
Oh yeah, just a spoiler, he is dead.
He is dead, yeah. Spoiler alert, he's dead. Died in 1999. When I read the obituary ages ago, I did think, oh, he's written that himself. And as it turned out, that was the truth. That was all people had to go on. You didn't have any information to contradict his version. And to some extent, it was like, oh, there's actually a bit of information out there. Let's use that. But as we shall see, there was some, I'd say, exaggerations in what he says, if not outright fabrications. However, the debate, one of the things that he says in the obituary is basically it was all his great big idea. And I suppose at least me, you've got into this debate, well, how much credit, in inverted commas, should he have? But I think it's a bit of a weird debate to have, because obviously, let's say he died, instead of in 1999, he died in 2020. Would he be boasting about it? So,
yeah, like credit or guilt.
I mean, his obituary hasn't weathered well, has it?
No. So when the SDS are formed in 68, he's a senior special branch officer. He's been in the cops for years, right?
He's a moderately senior chief inspector, which I suppose is middle ranking, detective chief inspector, middle ranking, sort of middle upper, I suppose you'd call it.
But he'd been in special branch for years doing the close protection or personal protection, whatever they call it.
That's right. But immediately before the SDS was formed, he was in B Squad, which was at that point looked after basically everybody on the left who wasn't a member of the Communist Party of Great Britain, plus fascists, weirdly enough.
He's a senior political cop. He'd been targeting the groups that the SDS went on to infiltrate for quite a few years by the time the now infamous March Against the Vietnam War takes place in 68.
He actually was one of the authors of a report, if you like, a post-match report on the March in 1968, the thing that got everyone overexcited in the media and was supposedly indirectly or directly the cause of the SDS being formed, depends on how you look at it. One of the things they concluded was they weren't getting enough intelligence about the groups involved in the anti-Vietnam War protests. However, it is notable in that report there's no recommendation to form an undercover unit. Simply the lack of intelligence is noted. One of the things that Dixon says in his self-penned obituary was that there was no intelligence coming on those groups. But in fact, the Special Branch file on the Vietnam Solidarity campaign was actually opened as soon as the campaign started in 1966. And in fact, there's a record of Dixon and MI5 talking about a couple of civilian informers that Dixon has in that area. So to say that's one inaccuracy.
Yeah. When I'm doing public speaking about the undercover policing thing, I use his probably apocryphal thing about he asked for 20 men, £500,000 and a free hand to start the SDS. I guess that
also comes from his obituary.
Yeah.
It's entirely inaccurate. Basically, the budget for the first year was £3,000.
Quite a come down from the £500,000.
I did do the inflation calculator, and even using that as nowhere near. I think we're actually one of the people I work with, the Undercover Research Group, Rosie Point. Now, although he says that's what he told them, he's very careful not to actually say that was accepted in his obituary. So in that way, I suppose he's a bit clever in it. Actually, the implication was that he was given £500,000, but he never actually says that. He just says that's what he asked for.
We've covered in previous episodes those early officers who were mostly subject to Tranche 1. We heard from a number of them. Doug Edwards, our first episode, was one of those officers. He goes and recruits these officers he would have been working with mostly on B Squad before the SDS were formed.
Yeah, our very first episode, Doug Edwards.
Yeah.
So they came from either B or C squads, that being the squad that mainly covered the Communist Party of Great Britain at that point.
So he sets this unit up. How much direction does he have of it? He's in charge of it, but has he formulated how it works?
Well, in his obituary, he makes out he has this master plan. Dixon and other senior special branch officers have a meeting with the Home Secretary, and that without him, obviously, it gets nodal approval from them. The accounts that on 31st of July 1968, a bunch of special branch officers, mainly junior special branch officers, get summoned to a room with Conrad Dixon, Phil Saunders, he was his number 2 in the unit, and told you were now in the SDS. But one of their accounts seems to suggest that they didn't really know what they were doing at that point. And Dixon basically asks these relatively young, inexperienced police officers, "Well, what should we do then, lads and lasses?" More or less, and it's very much ad hoc for sure. I mean, in some ways, you could like the way they operated initially. In the run up to the October demonstration, it's quite significantly different to what happened afterwards. For instance, they didn't even have their own cover accommodation. They might have had an idea of a job to say. They didn't really have any cover identification. It's almost like they were plainclothes officers with a cover name. At least most of them, at that point, they turned up at public meetings and got invited also to private meetings. I suppose that was a big difference between them and a plainclothes special branch officer. They went into people's homes for meetings.
At that time, they were very focused on what was going to happen at the second Vietnam Solidarity Campaign march in the October of the same year. As Mitting's interim report after the end of Tranche 1 suggested, that is the juncture where the unit should have been wound up. So, I mean, I get the impression it wasn't necessarily clear to officers working on it at the time if they would be going beyond that particular demonstration.
No, but I think most people, and Roy Creamer actually says that's what he thought was going to happen. Creamer was one of the few officers alive who one of the few officers still alive who was a contemporary of Dixon, and he gave some interesting evidence which we might touch on. Certainly comments on Dixon. But yeah, so I think it was focused on the October demonstration. They still acted as recipients of any information they could possibly glean. So it wasn't like they only reported information relevant to the October mobilisation. They still picked up any bits of information they could and put it on the special branch report, as they would do for the next 40 years.
Yeah.
So I suppose it was more focused, you could say, at that point.
The remit of special branch in general hadn't changed. Obviously, they were putting stuff on file for the next 40 years, but that's what special branch does.
Yes, and one of the interesting things is, we've talked about it before, was like the influence of MI5 on how the Special Demonstration Squad operated and what they did, their targets, etc. It does seem that that the initial meeting, the setup meeting, didn't involve MI5, but they were basically informed on the second day of operations that they did exist. There's evidence of that, of them being informed straight away. So I think in terms of MI5's influence on the SDS, that definitely was probably at that point less than it would be from 1969 onwards, so after the October demonstration.
He was popular, though. They liked him. The other SDS officers liked him. There's a few former officers who've given some negative comments about him, but most of them seem to like him.
There's a mixed. There are quite a few say he was affable, he's a nice boss, approachable, though quite a few officers say that he was a good manager, and in terms of a personnel manager, he seemed to get on with quite a few of them. Others, like Roy Creamer, had a less generous view of his motivations and his aptitude to the job that he set himself up in. For instance, Roy Creamer said he had no clue about the groups that the SDS was set up to infiltrate, for instance.
He seemed a bit of a silly. He called himself Captain Birdseye and wore a sailor's hat and stuff.
Some of the undercovers, like Margaret White, cover name, said in her statement that Conrad Dixon was approachable and friendly. Jean Hillier was also positive about the way Dixon behaved as a manager. However, say Creamer was probably the person who was most close to Dixon in terms of, at least according to Creamer, being an indispensable right-hand man. He said that he actually agreed with him in terms of personnel management, but he suggested that Dixon didn't take his role entirely seriously. For instance, Creamer said Dixon used the absurd cover name Tim Birdseye and also wore a sailor's hat when he attended VSC meetings.
Do we know much about his deployment undercover? Because he was deployed in one of the first officers.
He turned up at a few so with those initial few months, they didn't really know what they were doing, and also it seems at times they didn't have enough to do. Because there's one meeting where everybody's there almost. There's like 8 undercover officers at the one meeting. So which seems absurd, and so you would have thought like noticeable.
And pointless. As someone who's been in a meeting with 3 other people, 2 of whom were undercover cops, I sympathise with the poor buggers who was there.
So in terms of the best short comment was from Dick Epps, who described Dixon as a Brash Chancer. I think that's probably the most accurate and pithy comment. And Creamer goes on to say that he's less direct in his criticism. He basically says that if there's been anything of importance from the undercover officers, he would have been told, and Dixon and him would discuss the information, and then Creamer said, I would then draft what I thought we should say in the report. I put into words what I knew he ought to be saying. So basically the implication there is Dixon wouldn't be able to do that. He had to get like someone else, his junior officer, to do it for him. Enlarging on that, Creamer said he relied on my knowledge of the left, as it was not his speciality, and also Creamer said one of his roles was restraining him from doing anything really stupid.
There's always the danger, of course, that Creamer's just pointing out how indispensable he is.
There was, of course, an element of self-serving in Creamer's comments. Of course. However, when he's criticising other police officers, I'm happy to take him at his word.
Sure. Yeah. The thing is, Dixon's not actually in the SDS that long, really, is he?
No. We might go on to do Phil Saunders, who was his both second in command and also a successor as head of the unit. And I would definitely say that Saunders is a more important figure within it for various reasons.
He does leave the SDS fairly soon after it's formed, but the next thing he does is still political policing. He goes back to C Squad and targets the Free Wales Army. It's
not clear what squad he's in then. There's this thing which mysteriously appears in a couple of documents called X Squad. We're not quite entirely sure what that is. So this might be...
Anything to do with Wolverine or Storm? The uncanny X Squad.
So already in Wales, there's this Metropolitan Police unit called the Shrewsbury Squad. Obviously, Shrewsbury isn't in Wales.
As far as the Met Police are concerned, it might as well be.
Near enough. I think the idea was that they wanted to be separate from any Welsh local police, so there wasn't really, I think that was the idea behind it. Do you want to tell people a little bit of the story about the Free Wales Army?
Sure. The Free Wales Army was one of a number of organisations that appeared in the 1960s that took Welsh nationalism a bit more seriously and engaged in... I would say proto-paramilitary type activity. They announced themselves to the world going on the anniversary of the Easter Rising March in Dublin, where they turned up in uniform with a load of dogs and shotguns and marched behind the official IRA delegation in the early 60s. They often get confused with MAC, which was a much more serious organisation, John Jenkins, which did a wide-ranging bombing campaign across Wales. But at the same time, the Free Wales Army, led by a bloke called K.O. Evans, were wearing uniforms and drilling. They'd turn up at a Welsh village on a Saturday afternoon. They'd put guards on the streets, and they'd take over a pub and declare it an independent sovereign Wales. Quite a colourful group of people. A lot of heavy drinking involved, got the impression. Famously, there's the drowning of Capel Cerrin, which they turn up at, and they at the opening of it, and they turn the whole thing into a circus.
So, for people who don't know, there was a rural community which basically drowns. It was flooded, so England collapsed.
For Liverpool. Wales is full of reservoirs that exist on what used to be communities. Capel Cerrin was just one of the later ones, so it got a lot of TV cameras filmed the village, so it got a lot more coverage. But by this point, there had been so many of these things, particularly you see a lot of them in mid Wales for the flooding for the Birmingham Corporation. So when the Liverpool decided to do the same thing and flooded Capital Care, and it was a real push against it. There's like 98 people had to be relocated. They drowned the church and a number of farms and schoolhouse and so forth. The Free Wales Army came to real prominence then, and they did a lot. Like Hale was a horse breeder character, and he kind of looked like a gaucho, and did a lot of interviews with the press, making himself out to be some paramilitary leader.
So a lot of the protests were around, or became around, the investiture of Prince Charles, or at least that's what that's what the state was fearing. At least that's how the focus became.
Of course, John Jenkins was inside the British Army as a dentist. Was there for the investiture, set some bombs on a jetty, which, I mean, he came close, mate. He came close.
Basically, the only evidence that we have of Dixon's involvement really is from his obituary. This is Dixon himself saying so. So Dixon's skills were next called upon in Wales, where the Free Wales Army was setting up off minor explosions and was reported to be taking lessons from the IRA. The separatists were soon alarmed by the penetration of the groupsicles and even produced a poster about the danger, which appeared on a host of telegraph poles. It showed the listening figure at a bouncing crossroads with the caption, "Dixon's Secret Police in Wales." Before long, the principal bomb maker and his assistant were arrested and the movement collapsed. So there's a couple of things in there we discussed. Let's take the last thing first, which is the implication there that Dixon turned up and then wrapped up the investigation almost immediately due to his amazing detective skills. So this unit, as far as we know, existed before Dixon. So he was drafted in at some point after it formed. So there are obviously a whole bunch of other coppers detectives there already. How much credit he should or should not get.
I think he's conflated the Free Wales Army and MAC, which is the Movement for the Defence of Wales. It all unravelled in 69 when Alwyn Jones and George Taylor accidentally killed themselves when they were placing a bomb. That was kind of the end. I think John Jenkins couldn't really cope with that.
And I was going to say about the poster, it's actually true, and there was actually a photograph of believe it or not, that placard. Which to me, that's like a bit of a failure.
It was huge failure, especially with his name.
It's very secret, isn't it? Yeah. Because we got you on that. So I suggest I didn't. My guess from that is they were down the pub talking about it. So there was one special branch report dated 11th November 1969, which discusses Special Branch intelligence source who might have intelligence about the protests around the investiture of Prince Charles. And Dixon states in this report that the informant would not be useful in the future. But beyond that, we're not quite, as I say, there's no evidence really to confirm the extent of Dixon's involvement in that investigation, not least his claim that it was basically all down to him.
Yeah.
The story's not quite over there though, because 1970, Dixon's gets promoted. He's gone up a couple of ranks since being chief inspector. He's now chief superintendent. So for people who don't know all the ranks of them, you go from chief inspector to superintendent and then chief superintendent. So he's got up a couple of notches in the greasy pole. You're probably a worse pole than greasy, isn't it? Itty pole?
Vomit pole. It's kind of greatest hits of late 60s, early 70s paramilitary movements. He then goes on to target the Angry Brigade.
He's part of this investigation, the actual special branch detachment within the main investigation. The actual main investigation is led by mainstream CID detectives, so not special branch, by a guy called Roy Havisham. However, but it's interesting actually because Cream actually... So there's a book on the Angry Brigade which has a transcript of an interview with Roy Creamer in the back, and basically Creamer gives most of the credit for the investigation to Roy Havisham. However, that's not what Dixon says in his obituary. So Dixon says again in his obituary that he headed the intelligence unit. He may well have been the most senior special branch officer, but he definitely was not leading the investigation. For the Angry Brigade inquiry, Dixon found that they had two weaknesses. They lived in communes which are natural ports of call for other revolutionaries and financed their activities by cheque and credit card fraud. However, Cream was quite clear it was actually Havisham who discovered the cheque fraud angle. So there's actually one quite interesting Special branch report written by Creamer, which is relatively early on in the Angry Brigade investigation, which gives us a state of play. Well, it's a really interesting historical document.
I wonder if do you think you did any work in between? Or did you just kind of set up the undercover unit, take on the Welsh nationalists, then he's after the Angry Brigade?
Well, it sounds like he's got a bit of ADHD, doesn't he?
Yeah.
I mean, there's one thing, and I want to do another thing now. I'm bored of this. He seems like this. I think that also the image that he likes to portray himself in his obituary of this almost raffish amateur, sort of going from one thing. It's like a Sherlock Holmes or the gentleman burglar, Raffles. He does a bit of this, bit of that. Doesn't take things too seriously, but he's just great at everything that he tries. I'm surprised at some point in his obituary he doesn't like. Oh yes, and I was suddenly called up by the English cricket team to they were in a bit of a tight spot, and I had to fit in on a test matches and throw away. But yeah, that's the kind of impression that he wants to give. That he's this kind of like poshish guy who chooses to get in the police. Yeah, talking about his family backgrounds, Donal, my colleague, done a bit of digging into his ancestry stuff. His full name is Conrad Hepworth Dixon, and Hepworth isn't exactly a middle name, it's more like a family name. There's a few of his ancestors. He was a Manchester reformer, it's more of a liberal guy. But going a bit back further, there was a guy who would have been great-great-uncle or something like that. He was actually arrested at Peterlee and jailed. Peterlee, which has a link in with one of your recent podcasts, because obviously Maxine Peake was in the Peterlee film. It was out a few years ago.
I mean, that's a tenuous link, mate. But yeah, thanks for that smashing nicey link there.
I know. Proud of that one.
But not long after the Angry Brigade stuff, he retires from the cops, right?
Yeah, it is a bit. What he says in his obituary that they try to make him basically get promoted again to to the upper echelons of policing.
Don't try and change me, baby. I'm not for the desk. I'm for the field.
And what he says in his obituary is it's like trying to make it a captain of a bunch of irregulars become. However, as it turns out, the inquiry published his personnel record, his record of service, and he retired sick. So.
I hope I get to write my own obituary. You can really big yourself up. If it hadn't been for this inquiry and stuff, he'd probably be thought of by all sorts of people who cared or bothered to look as being some great achiever. But we now know that he's a bit of a bullshit artist, basically.
This charge lent August 1973 at the age of 46 on the grounds of ill health. Back then, it was still the case, the coppers retire on a full pension at 50. So 3 years later, what he did afterwards, it's not all that interesting, but basically he became a maritime academic and published a bunch of books on maritime navigation, almost of no interest to anybody. I think there's one of how to navigate using a pocket calculator. So obviously not entirely relevant. But as it turned out, Dixon had been less than discreet about the supposedly secret of the SDS. So in 1976, an MI5 document referred to a training course that Dixon had run before retirement for police forces outside London, where he detailed SDS operations. The note suggested that there was knowledge of the SDS throughout England's police forces, but another special branch officer commented the dissemination of this information was said to have been a mistake on Dixon's behalf.
We've heard so many former undercover officers who've been called to give evidence to the undercover policing inquiry, going up and going, I had no idea. There were whispers, there were rumours. But I was a special branch officer for many years and I had no idea about the SDS. It sounds unbelievable then, but when you put it with that, it's even more unbelievable.
Then the publication of his obituary as well, and he died in April 1999, 13th of April 1999, the Times, among others, published his obituary, which is basically faxed from his house on the day after he died to Scotland Yard to be okayed for publication. Which they totally okay, even though it seemed to give quite a few secrets away. I mean, they changed the unit's nickname from the Hairy to Scruffy Squad, but obviously otherwise they expressed no concerns about the publication of it.
Don't let them know that we called the Hairies. They think we called the Scruffies instead.
If anyone's interested, C. Dixon, Navigation by Pocket Calculator, Granada Publishing.
On the reading list.
There's a couple of other things, though, I suppose we skimmed over. Dixon was involved. He proposed a continuation. Not quite sure. And this is so basically the October demos are all over. October 1968, the operations are basically declared a great success. And then almost immediately in November, Dixon's already proposing the continuation of the squad. And by the 11th of November, that is okayed all the way up the special branch hierarchy. Probably unsurprising, I suppose, in retrospect. It's interesting, there was one reservation expressed, and that was by a senior civil servant in the Home Office called James Waddell. And then they agreed into the extension till summer of 1969, because it was only for another 6 months initially. He said he felt that an enterprise of this kind, there's always a slight danger of the innovations like the one we are considering become an accepted part of the scene, so that the discontinuance might be thought to be a drastic change. And that's exactly what happens. Because basically, like 1968, you have a Labour government. 1970, the government changes to the Tories.
Yep.
So basically, by 1970, the secret of the SDS, that is held by both a Labour and a Conservative government, and obviously the two parties that govern Britain for the next 50 years. So it's not just Special Branch's secret to keep. It's the two governing parties from the point of view of the following Home Secretaries. They're thinking, well, the unit's going on and nobody's found out about it. So if I stop it, is that going to change? And then it becomes an embarrassment. Because whoever it comes out for, whoever's in government, Labour or Tories, is going to become an embarrassment.
Right, yeah.
Both of them. So this isn't documented. This is just my take on it, my interpretation of why they allowed this unit to carry on, because it clearly was a reputational risk. Wasn't it?
I think the British state are doing things that are always of reputational risk.
It's a part of like the gamble was, this isn't going to land on my lap. Basically, it would be the next guy who gets fucking, and that's basically how it went on. That's my take on it. Why? Because it wasn't just like Special Branch, MI5. It was Home Secretaries, one after the other. From a pragmatic point of view, this is like, we got an accident waiting to happen.
I mean, you do wonder how many other accidents waiting to happen are out there that we haven't learnt about.
Exactly, yeah. In terms of the extension of the unit, Dixon wrote this paper, unfortunately, called The Penetration of Extremist Groups. And within the inquiry, former officers were questioned on whether this paper reflected the reality of how the unit was ran. Most of them said no, and in some ways that isn't surprising, because in fact there was a discussion by senior Special Branch officers referred to this paper, but it didn't seem any of them bothered to read it. And in fact, the decision to go ahead with the squad had already been made by the time the paper had been published. So it's very much like an academic exercise. This is like Dixon's take on what it should be. One of the most obvious things which goes away from what he suggested is that he said that none of the deployments should last for more than a year. And pretty shortly afterwards, the standard deployment, what became 4 years, almost immediately. The other thing is, which is forbidden according to Dixon, is for undercovers to make prominent roles in groups, and that again happened almost immediately after 1968, after Dixon left the unit. I think actually probably it happened whilst he was in the unit. It wasn't like Dixon was the good guy, he wanted to run the unit properly and then the scene would feel that's not the story I'm trying to tell at all. But certainly it didn't seem that this manual, the early blueprint for the squad that Dixon wrote, basically, he was pretty much ignored.
Thought it was special, didn't he?
He's definitely not as important as he thought he was.
That goes for all the undercover cops, right?
He definitely was important in terms of, we don't know when they had this meeting with the Home Secretary or the Home Office whose idea it was, really. Certainly the inquiry credit him, if credit's the right word, obviously not the right word. It was his brainchild, but that is just taken from his obituary. We don't know. One thing I don't like about that, it becomes like an individual fault rather than institutional.
Sure.
The blame should be shared around and not just put on dead people. It's definitely institutional. It was like the whole British state as highlight it.
Don't hate the player, hate the game.
Well, both.
Both. Hate all the players and the game.
All the games.
And the stadium and the owners and the fans and everything about it, really.
Maybe the next one we should do is probably Phil Sanders, and we can see the differences and how it unfolds from then onwards. If you like, the seeds of disaster were sown in 1968. It was started to sprout in 1969.
An episode on Phil Sanders coming soon. Other than that, thanks for joining us. If you haven't heard us before, there's loads of previous episodes. Please subscribe to wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you're able to give us a review, or 5 stars if you please, tell your friends about us. Thanks for listening. Cheers. Bye.
Bye.